Barbara Payton was born into an era that promised glamour to any blue-eyed beauty who caught Hollywood's gaze. She wanted everything that the Dream Factory had to offer: star billing, magazine covers, a lavish home with an open-door policy for champagne-fueled gatherings. If you'd seen her in 1949, you might have believed she had it all in her grasp. Blonde, vivacious, and free-spirited, she radiated a raw, unapologetic energy that lured casting directors. She was the new face of Hollywood's bright promise, a small-town girl whisked into the limelight, poised to become the next big thing. She was born in Cloquet, Minnesota. Some accounts place her birth in 1927, others in 1928, and her parents, Lee and Mabel, soon moved the family to Odessa, Texas. Even early on, Barbara had a headstrong, restless spirit. She longed for more than dusty roads and small-town gossip. She found an exit through an unexpected route: marriage. It was 1943. World War II raged on, and she was barely out of childhood when she decided to wed her high school sweetheart, William Hodge. Some say they married under the romantic notion that with the war, life was short, and you had to seize whatever happiness you could. But Barbara's definition of happiness quickly clashed with the norms of a stable domestic life. Within a few years, the union fell apart in a swirl of rumors about her extramarital affairs. By 1948, that marriage was effectively over, though it took time for the official process to unravel. She next tried again with John Lee Payton in 1945, a union that might have been an attempt at stability. They had a son, John, born in 1947. For a while, Barbara tried to embrace the domestic mold, cooking dinners, caring for her toddler, telling herself this might be the life she wanted. But the magnetic pull of Hollywood was too strong. She had begun venturing into modeling, auditioning for small roles, letting producers and photographers see the platinum-haired starlet who could flash a dazzling grin one moment and scald you with a stare the next. By 1950, she was on the brink of an actual film career. She ended up divorcing John Payton that same year, effectively choosing the promise of Tinseltown over the responsibilities of hearth and home. And as tabloids discovered she was no shrinking violet, rumors circulated that she had already had private rendezvous with major film stars like James Cagney, especially after working on Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye. No one knew the truth for sure, but the press swiftly labeled her dangerous, implying that she was the kind of woman who blurred lines, who couldn't be contained by conventional morality. This was the public image forming around her. She was rebellious, impulsive, and unstoppable. One might have predicted a short career meltdown, but Hollywood in the early 1950s still had an appetite for scandal, as long as you looked the part. There was an undercurrent of fascination around Barbara Payton. She was raw, sexy, and capable of overshadowing more polished, refined actresses. She landed a handful of roles, including Trapped, 1949, and Bride of the Gorilla, 1951. Directors praised her for an earthy, almost reckless charisma that the camera devoured. She wasn't an ethereal screen goddess. She was flesh and blood, potent enough to induce longing or dread. But that same intensity spilled into her private life, forming an explosive mixture that would soon wreck her career. In 1951, one scandal shattered whatever illusions remained about Barbara's place in Hollywood. She was dating Franchot Tone at the time, an established star of dignified presence known for his roles in high-profile films, and for once being married to Joan Crawford. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a stabilizing match, the rebellious starlet and the cultured leading man forging a sophisticated relationship. But behind the scenes, Barbara was also seeing Tom Neal, an actor known mostly for B-movies, and interestingly enough for having been a boxer. Tom Neal was rugged, a bit rough around the edges, and exuded a brooding energy. She toggled between Tone's refined charm and Neil's dangerous magnetism, apparently relishing the drama. On September 13th, 1951, the tension exploded in the most public, humiliating manner. Tom Neil assaulted front show Tone outside Barbara's apartment, pummeling him so severely that Tone suffered a concussion, fractured bones in his face, and slipped into a coma. The tabloids churned out lurid headlines. Photographers captured Tone's bruised face, broadcasting the savage beating. The scandal turned Barbara Payton into a household name, but for all the wrong reasons. Hollywood watched in shock. An actress they were grooming for stardom was now the central figure in a love triangle culminating in near homicide. Still, in a twist no screenwriter could have penned more dramatically, Barbara went ahead and married Franchot Tone on September 28, 1951, just 2 weeks after he was beaten into a coma. He emerged from the hospital, battered but still besotted, and she married him in a rush ceremony. The union made headlines as a bizarre testament to Hollywood mania, but it lasted all of 53 days. By then, Barbara had either grown bored or realized she still wanted Tom Neil. She left Tone, returning to Neil in a move that defied all logic. By February 1952, her divorce from Tone was final, and she was publicly stepping out with Tom Neil again. Hollywood's reaction was swift. Major studios blacklisted her. Directors who once admired her on-camera spark now saw her as a ticking time bomb. She was no longer just impulsive or fun-loving. She was potentially lethal to a production's PR. The dream of top-tier stardom crumbled. Her name became an industry punchline, associated with sensational tabloids rather than actual film merit. She tried to pick up smaller parts, but producers were wary. Audiences, too, were unsettled by the story of her personal life overshadowing her talents. By 1953, her finances were in free fall. Once upon a time, she'd been under contract for $1,000 a week. Good money for an up-and-coming actress? Now that well had dried up. Desperate for quick cash, she wrote a check for $12 at a liquor store. A paltry sum that might not have raised eyebrows if it hadn't been fraudulent. The store owner complained, and Barbara found herself under arrest for check fraud. She insisted it was a misunderstanding, but the damage was done. Mug shots splashed across the tabloids with headlines like "Blonde Bombshell Busted," capturing the spectacle of her downfall. The sum involved was trivial, but the incident underscored how far she'd fallen. In an era where the film community measured wealth in thousands per week, Barbara Payton was forging a check for $12 just to get by, and still she pressed on with an uncanny bravado. In 1955, she married George Tony Provaz, hoping perhaps that this stable relationship might reset her course. But stability eluded her. She cheated on him, apparently repeating the same destructive patterns that had torpedoed her previous marriages. By 1958, that relationship ended in yet another bitter divorce. The tabloids followed each new fiasco with near sadistic glee. She was acquiring nicknames like the most married actress in Hollywood, but the truth was simply that Barbara was a woman spiraling deeper into chaos. In 1962, unbelievably, she tried again. She wed Jess Raleigh, a salesman in the furniture business. Maybe she thought a down-to-earth spouse from outside the volatile film world could ground her. Instead, by 1967, they were separated. She had by then endured 5 marriages, each dissolving into scandal, financial ruin, or mutual acrimony. Professionally, there was no career to speak of. She tried returning to modeling, but her infamy overshadowed any residual star power. Worse, she had turned to sex work to survive. Once commanding $10,000 paychecks for a single film, she now sold her body for anywhere between $5 to $100 a trick. drifting from cheap motel rooms to seedy bars along Sunset Boulevard. By the early 1960s, the Hollywood machine that once courted her had moved on. There were always fresh faces to exploit, new starlets to promote, younger, untainted reputations for studios to craft. Barbara Payton, once able to call James Cagney a co-star, had become a ghost haunting the darkest corners of Tinseltown. Her multiple arrests for solicitation, culminating in a bust on Sunset in 1962, made small headlines. But the public was already tired of her. She was no longer a hot story, she was a sad footnote, and she was deteriorating fast. Alcohol became her constant companion, along with pills and eventually heroin. She wrote or co-wrote a memoir, I Am Not Ashamed, released in 1963 with the help of Leo Guild, in which she recounted her journey from stardom to prostitution. The book was raw, shocking, and painfully frank. She admitted to her destructive behavior, her cravings, her inability to break cycles of addiction and toxic relationships. Readers devoured it, appalled and titillated. Critics called it exploitative, but Barbara insisted it was her truth. She needed the money, but she also seemed driven by a genuine compulsion to bear it all. Perhaps she hoped that if people read her story, they'd understand the avalanche that crushed her. Maybe she just needed to exorcise the demons. Instead, many saw it as yet another spectacle, further fueling the public's prurient interest in her downfall. And her life was indeed precarious. She was stabbed in April 1962 by a client named John Bobby Payton, no relation to her ex-husband, following a drunken argument. The knife nearly punctured her heart, leaving her bleeding on the floor in a cheap rented room. She needed emergency surgery to survive. The police considered charges, but Barbara claimed she had provoked him and asked that he not be prosecuted. The press ate it up, labeling it the epitome of her dangerous, chaotic existence. By then, no studio dared to associate with her. No major star wanted to be publicly seen with her, and even the tabloids were beginning to view her misadventures as repetitive. By 1967, her body finally started to betray her in a more permanent way. Years of cheap vodka, heroin, and barbiturates had wrecked her health. She developed cirrhosis of the liver, congestive heart failure, and severe malnutrition. She weighed under 90 pounds, her once lustrous blonde hair now dull, brittle, and thinning. Her face, once a glamorous marquee draw, bore the marks of exhaustion, scarring, and the sallow complexion of someone who lived in perpetual hangovers. The men in her life, clients, ex-husbands, fleeting boyfriends, occasionally beat her. She lost track of how many times the police picked her up for public intoxication. The last known arrest was in February 1967, when she got into a brawl at a bar. By that point, she had nowhere else to turn but home, so she returned to live with her parents, Mabel and Lee, in San Diego. She'd come full circle, from the rebellious teen bride who thought she could conquer Hollywood, to a broken woman in her late 30s who needed her parents' care just to avoid dying on the streets. The neighbors in San Diego whispered about the gaunt, haggard figure stepping out to buy more liquor, sometimes needing help just to walk to the car. The brilliance of her youth was a distant memory. She rarely heard from her son John, who by then was 20 and serving in the military. One wonders what he thought, aware of his mother's plight but powerless to save her. On May 8, 1967, around 2:30 in the afternoon, Barbara Payton collapsed in her parents' bathroom. Mabel found her, unresponsive, the shell of a once vibrant woman. She was declared dead at the scene, the official cause listing her long-standing heart and liver conditions. No autopsy was performed. There seemed little point, given the obvious progressive damage she had sustained. She was 39, though some sources contended she was 38. That detail encapsulated the confusion surrounding her life. Even her birth year had multiple accounts, as though the entire story of Barbara Payton existed in a haze of uncertain facts and contradictory rumors. There was no grand Hollywood send-off for her funeral. No major star came to pay respects. When the service took place on May 12, 1967, at St. Andrew's Lutheran Church, only a handful of relatives and a few remaining friends showed up. She was laid to rest at Cypress View Mausoleum, plot 112. The family couldn't afford a headstone, so for a while her grave was unmarked, as though her life itself had been erased from the annals of Hollywood's memory. Eventually, a modest nameplate appeared, but it attracted no pilgrimages from fans. The tabloids, once so eager to publish her every humiliation, relegated her death to minor local news. Meanwhile, the men who had factored so heavily in her public downfall were nowhere in sight. Tom Neal, the ex-boxer who had beaten Franchot Tone into a coma for her love, was in prison for manslaughter by then, having shot his wife in 1965. Franchot Tone had moved on long ago, remarried, and presumably tried to bury the fiasco of 1951 in the dustbin of memory. James Cagney, rumored to have once had a fling with her, never acknowledged her publicly. No pillars of the film community offered tributes or set up charitable donations in her name. Barbara Payton's flame had been extinguished, and the town that once found her transgressions so scandalous seemed wholly indifferent at her end. If one stands at her grave today, the hush of the mausoleum might speak to the quiet end that awaited so many starlets who didn't fit the mold. She was neither a triumphant icon nor a quietly graceful has-been. She was a loud, blazing figure whose flame consumed itself in real time, leaving behind the faintest memory of brilliance. And in that memory, embedded within countless Hollywood stories, Barbara Payton lives on. A cautionary figure, a tragic star, a rebellious spirit who soared too close to the sun and paid with a broken life. She reminds us that the glitter of a marquee can blind us to the darkness lurking backstage, and that sometimes the greatest drama in Hollywood isn't scripted. It's real life, raw and devastating, unfolding in the tabloids, the courtrooms, and the lonely motel rooms where lost dreams go to die.